Who is she again? I know her name. I can't remember.
How's UMass were you?
Part 1. The wrong assumption. The retrieval failure. A familiar face appears across the room. You recognize the person immediately. You know where you met them. You remember their personality. You remember specific conversations from years ago. The entire relationship reconstructs in seconds. Then something happens that does not fit. The name does not arrive. You know it. You can feel the information existing somewhere inside your mind. You reach for it the way you would reach for something you left on a table. Certain it is there. Certain your hand will find it. It is not there. The harder you search, the farther the name seems to retreat. The conversation continues around you. You offer a smile. You introduce the person as an old friend. You make it work. A few seconds later, the name returns, arriving with no fanfare, no explanation, just suddenly present in a way it was not before. The moment is dismissed almost instantly. A similar failure occurs with words. You are mid-sentence. The idea is fully formed. You know exactly what you are trying to say. Then a familiar word disappears. Not a rare word, not a technical term, but something ordinary. A word you have used hundreds of times, a word that has never failed you before. The sentence stalls, your brain searches, the word returns, life continues. Neuroscientists have established that the brain pathways responsible for retrieving names and words begin measurably changing years, sometimes decades, before most people would describe themselves as cognitively aging. The changes do not announce themselves. They do not produce pain or fatigue or any internal signal at all. They produce something far more difficult to detect. A brain that continues functioning normally while quietly reorganizing itself around the fact that something is no longer working the way it once did. Understanding what that reorganization actually is, the specific biological mechanism behind it, and why it remains invisible for so long, changes what these ordinary moments mean. These moments become more frequent after 40. A missing name, a missing word, a phrase that refuses to arrive. Most people reach for easy explanations. Stress, distraction, too much happening at once. The explanation feels reasonable, and buried inside it is an assumption almost no one examines. If something important were changing inside the brain, you would know. This belief feels self-evident. When eyesight deteriorates, you notice. When hearing changes, you notice. When muscles weaken, you notice. We assume the brain should obey the same logic. If it were failing, surely the person living inside it would be the first to understand. The brain does not work that way. It is one of the only organs capable of adapting to its own deterioration in real time, quietly rerouting, quietly compensating, quietly maintaining the appearance of normal function while the underlying architecture is already changing. A person can experience the early consequences of neurological aging and interpret every single one of them as something else entirely. Knowing versus retrieving. To understand why these moments occur, it is necessary to separate two processes that feel identical but are not. Knowing a word and retrieving a word. The fact that the word eventually returned tells you something important. The information was never destroyed. The memory still existed. The concept was stored somewhere inside the brain, exactly where it has always been. What failed was not knowledge. What failed was access. Language is not stored the way most people imagine. Words do not sit inside a single region waiting to be summoned. Meaning, sound, association, grammatical function, emotional context. These are distributed across multiple networks that must coordinate rapidly every time a word is produced. The correct entry must be identified, selected, assembled, and delivered within fractions of a second. When everything functions efficiently, the process feels effortless. The word appears, the sentence continues, the machinery remains invisible. When the communication between those networks becomes slightly less efficient, the first signs are exactly what you would expect. A delay, a brief search, A few uncomfortable seconds where the machinery is visible for the first time. The word still arrives. The information still exists. But the pathway leading to it has changed. And that is where the real question begins. Not why the word failed to arrive, but how long the pathway had already been changing before that moment ever became visible. Part 2. The hidden network, white matter, and the architecture of communication. If retrieving a word depends on coordination between multiple brain regions, an obvious question follows. How do those regions communicate? Most people picture the brain as a collection of specialized compartments. One area for language, another for memory, another for vision, each zone handling its own domain. This picture is useful. It is also incomplete. Beneath the gray matter visible in brain scans lies a vast infrastructure most people never hear about. White matter. Long bundles of myelinated nerve fibers connecting distant brain regions to one another. Every sentence you have ever produced, every memory you have ever retrieved, every decision you have ever made, each one depended on information traveling through these pathways at speed. Without white matter integrity, specialized regions lose much of their meaning. A memory stored in one area cannot be accessed by another. A concept recognized in one network cannot be converted into language by another. A name identified by one system cannot be delivered before the moment passes. White matter is not where information is stored. White matter is how information moves. Language makes this dependency visible. The semantic meaning of a word involves networks spread across temporal and frontal regions. Its sound pattern, the phonological form, requires separate processing. The motor plan for producing it requires additional systems. The act of speaking a single word in real time depends on all of these networks exchanging information within milliseconds, successfully, every time. When that exchange works, the experience is effortless. When it becomes slightly less efficient, the first consequence is a small delay, a fraction of a second longer. A brief search that was not there before, small enough to dismiss, large enough eventually to notice. The biology that preceded the symptom. Most people locate the beginning of aging at the first symptom, the first forgotten name, the first missing word, the first obvious interruption. Neuroscience does not support that location. White matter integrity begins showing measurable changes in many individuals during their 30s and 40s, decades before most people describe any cognitive difficulty. These changes are not dramatic. No single day feels different from the day before. The decline in signal transmission efficiency is gradual, distributed across pathways, and hidden behind a brain that has not yet exhausted its capacity to compensate. Processing speed follows a similar trajectory. This is not intelligence. Processing speed is the rate at which information can move through neural systems. A person may possess the same knowledge, the same experience, the same reasoning capacity, and still require slightly more time to access all of it. The difference is often imperceptible to anyone other than the person experiencing it. A familiar name takes a fraction longer. A complex problem requires marginally more concentration. The brain still succeeds. The journey takes slightly longer. The changes are measurable long before they are noticeable. The biology and the experience no longer match. The person feels normal. The machinery has already begun adapting. This is the hidden period. The years between when biological change begins and when awareness finally catches up. During this time, the brain is not standing still. It is working harder than it was before, quietly allocating additional resources to maintain the same outputs, quietly rerouting communication through alternative pathways, quietly protecting the experience of normality while the architecture beneath it shifts. The person goes to work, manages their life, has conversations, makes decisions. Everything appears intact. The internal workload has already increased. Part 3. The performance illusion. Compensation and the biology of hidden adaptation. The brain does not passively receive change. It responds to it. When a pathway becomes less efficient, alternative routes may activate. When one network struggles, adjacent networks may absorb part of the load. When a task requires more resources than it previously did, the brain reallocates. This adaptive capacity is one of the defining features of human neurology. It is not unique to aging. Developing brains use it while learning. Adult brains use it while recovering from injury. Older brains use it while managing the gradual erosion of efficiency. The brain is a dynamic system. It reorganizes, it compensates, it finds ways to maintain outputs, even as inputs become harder to coordinate. Neuroimaging has made this compensation visible. In study after study, older adults performing the same cognitive tasks as younger adults show broader and more bilateral patterns of neural activation. More regions recruited, more systems involved, more brain to produce the same result. The outcome is similar. The effort is not. This creates one of the most important illusions in human biology. The illusion of stable performance. A person continues managing responsibilities, solves problems, maintains relationships, performs professionally. Family members notice nothing. Colleagues notice nothing. The person themselves may feel largely unchanged. From the outside, nothing has shifted. Inside the brain, the biological cost of appearing unchanged has been quietly increasing for years. Compensation is remarkable. Without it, cognitive aging would become visible far earlier. But compensation carries a consequence that rarely gets discussed. It disguises the very process it is compensating for. The person points to their career, to their daily functioning, to their maintained relationships. All of it is real. All of it reflects genuine capacity, and none of it is reliable evidence that nothing is changing underneath. Feeling normal does not mean nothing is changing. It may simply mean that compensation is still working. Cognitive reserve and the inequality of aging. Two people of the same age can experience the same degree of biological change and present with dramatically different outward performance. One continues functioning sharply, the other begins noticing difficulty. The biology is similar, the outcome is not. Part of the explanation is reserve. Cognitive reserve is not a single structure. It is a cumulative property of the brain, shaped over decades by education, mental engagement, novel learning, social complexity, and adaptive challenge. Brains with greater reserve have developed more connections, more alternative pathways, more redundancy in the networks supporting critical functions. When biological aging erodes efficiency, a brain with greater reserve can compensate longer. It has more routes available. It can absorb more change before visible decline emerges. A brain with less reserve encounters the same biological change and runs out of alternatives sooner. This is why the visible onset of cognitive difficulty is such an unreliable indicator of when the underlying process began. It tells you when compensation became insufficient. It does not tell you when the change started. Those are very different moments, potentially separated by years, possibly decades. Other variables compound this complexity. Cardiovascular health, sleep quality, metabolic function, physical activity, chronic stress. Each shapes the environment in which the brain ages. Each influences the rate at which white matter pathways degrade, the efficiency with which neurons communicate, the stability of the systems responsible for retrieval, attention, and working memory. Two people with identical genetic backgrounds can follow different neurological trajectories depending on how these variables accumulate over a lifetime. There is no universal aging timeline. There are only individual timelines, unfolding through the same biological logic. Part 4. The slow changes. No one sees beneath language. The broader erosion word retrieval attracts attention because it is audible. A sentence pauses. Something is clearly missing. The social context makes the failure impossible to ignore. Most of the early changes in cognitive aging are not like that. They occur beneath the level of observation. The person experiences the consequence without connecting it to a biological process. Processing speed is the clearest example. Information moves through neural systems slightly more slowly than it once did. The change accumulates across years rather than arriving on any single morning. The task still completes. The outcome is still fine. Only the efficiency has changed, and efficiency changes are nearly impossible to detect from the inside, because the only reference point available is your own history, and your own history has been changing alongside you. Attention and task switching follow the same pattern. Sustaining focus requires active coordination between neural systems, not a passive state. As white matter efficiency changes, that coordination gradually costs more. The effect rarely appears as failure. It appears as fatigue. Tasks that once felt automatic beginning to feel mentally expensive. Conversations requiring slightly more effort to track. Transitions between competing demands leaving a faint processing gap where none existed before. The brain still manages. The management simply requires more of it. Working memory, the system that holds information temporarily active while it is being used, is subject to the same gradual pressure. Most people never notice it functioning, because it normally functions invisibly. Over time, the threshold for overload moves slightly lower. The system continues working. It simply has less margin than it once did. Word retrieval becomes visible because language is social and time-sensitive. The failure has an audience. The changes in processing speed, attention, and working memory are invisible for the opposite reason. They manifest as effort rather than failure. The person still succeeds. The compensation is still working. Most people measure outcomes. Very few notice that the cost of producing those outcomes has been quietly increasing for years. The threshold problem. There is a specific illusion that almost everyone falls for. The illusion of sudden decline. People describe a specific year, a conversation they remember, a name they forgot in a way that felt different, a sentence that stalled in a way that unsettled them. The event feels significant precisely because it appears new. If this is the first moment it became visible, it must also be the moment it began. This is not how the biology works. Biological systems can absorb substantial change before producing observable failure. Compensation remains effective. Alternative pathways carry the load. Neural reserve buffers the deficit. Performance remains stable. Then, gradually, the buffering capacity becomes less complete. Small gaps appear. The system can no longer fully conceal every consequence. A symptom becomes visible, not because the process suddenly began, because the capacity to hide the process has finally become insufficient. This is the threshold problem. The symptom appears at a threshold of detectability, not at the origin of the biological change. These two moments are different, often substantially different. The visible event, the forgotten name, the missing word, the longer pause, is typically the final stage of a process rather than its beginning. Imagine a long staircase descending into a darkened room. Each step represents a small biological change, a slight reduction in white matter efficiency, a minor increase in retrieval latency, a small decrease in working memory capacity, a fractional slowing in processing speed. No single step changes the experience. No single step signals to the person that anything is different. The staircase grows longer day by day. The brain adapts, step by step, concealing each increment. Then one day a word fails to arrive during an important conversation. For the first time, the person notices. The moment feels new. It feels like a change has just occurred. In reality, awareness has simply caught up with a process that was already well underway. The staircase was already long. The person simply could not see it.
If you're fascinated by documentaries like this, subscribe to Pathology of Fear. New medical documentaries every week.
What is actually failing? Myelin, signal fidelity, and the fraying of speed. The pathway that fails to deliver a word on time is not abstract. It has a specific biological structure, and that structure changes in a specific way across adulthood. Every nerve fiber in white matter is wrapped in myelin, a dense, fatty sheath that insulates the axon and makes electrical signals propagate reliably at speed. Myelin is not decoration. It is the mechanism that allows distant brain regions to exchange information fast enough to function as a coordinated system. The physics of unmyelinated or poorly myelinated axons is straightforward. Signals move more slowly, lose amplitude over distance, and are more susceptible to interference. Myelin solves all three problems simultaneously. A well-myelinated pathway can transmit signals at speeds approaching 120 meters per second. A degraded pathway carries the same information, but the transmission becomes less precise and the timing becomes less reliable. Myelin is not permanent. It is a living structure, maintained continuously by specialized cells called oligodendrocytes. Across adulthood, this maintenance becomes increasingly imperfect. The myelin sheath loses density in some regions. Gaps develop. The insulation thins. The signal still travels. The fidelity changes. This matters because the brain's coordination systems depend not just on whether signals arrive, but on precisely when they arrive. Language networks operating in real time require multiple regions to exchange information within narrow timing windows. Semantic systems must activate before phonological systems can begin selecting sound patterns. Phonological systems must complete their work before motor planning can proceed. Each stage depends on the previous one finishing on schedule. When myelin integrity degrades, those timing windows narrow. Signals arrive slightly out of phase. Networks that once coordinated cleanly begin requiring additional cycles to achieve the same alignment. From the outside, this looks like a brief pause. From the inside, it feels like reaching for something that keeps moving slightly beyond reach. Why the frontal lobe compensates first? There is a pattern in how the aging brain responds to white matter degradation that reveals something important about the compensation process. When posterior language networks, the temporal and parietal regions that store semantic content and phonological forms, encounter retrieval difficulty, the frontal lobe increases its involvement. Specifically, the left inferior frontal gyrus, a region involved in controlled retrieval and selection among competing candidates, shows heightened activation. This is not a failure. It is a strategy. The frontal retrieval system operates differently from automatic retrieval. Automatic retrieval is fast, direct, and requires minimal effort. A frequently accessed word activates its phonological form almost reflexively. The frontal control system, by contrast, operates by actively searching, evaluating competing candidates, and suppressing incorrect responses until the correct target is isolated. It is slower, it is more resource-intensive, and it can succeed where automatic retrieval has failed. This explains something that seems counterintuitive about early language aging. People often report that they eventually find the word, but the process feels different. It requires effort it did not previously require. This is not imagination. This is the literal biological signature of a shift from one retrieval system to another, from the fast automatic pathway to the slower controlled pathway. The word arrives. The mechanism that delivered it has changed. Frontal compensation also extends beyond language. As processing efficiency declines across multiple systems, the prefrontal cortex increasingly functions as an executive coordinator, attempting to manage tasks that previously ran more automatically through dedicated networks. More frontal involvement in memory retrieval. More frontal involvement in attention management. More frontal involvement in tasks that younger brains delegate to faster, more specialized posterior systems. The frontal lobe compensates because it can, because its architecture supports flexible control rather than fixed function. But compensation through the frontal system carries a cost that becomes relevant as aging progresses. The frontal lobe is also aging. The system being asked to compensate for deteriorating efficiency is itself subject to the same white matter degradation it is compensating for. The retrieval network under stress. Word retrieval in the aging brain is not simply slower. The internal architecture of how retrieval unfolds begins to change. In younger adults, the process of activating a word is relatively selective. The target item activates strongly. Semantically related competitors, Words with overlapping meaning, similar sound, or shared context are suppressed efficiently. The target wins the competition quickly. As inhibitory efficiency declines with age, this competitive landscape becomes noisier. Related competitors remain more active for longer. The target must differentiate itself against a less efficiently suppressed background. The retrieval system selects correctly, but the process requires more time, more cycles, more neural resources devoted to resolution. This is why the tip of the tongue state, that specific experience of knowing a word exists, knowing its meaning, perhaps knowing its first letter or how many syllables it contains, while being unable to actually produce it, becomes more frequent with age. The semantic content is fully activated. The connection to the phonological form is degraded. The person experiences a system that is partially working, concept present, sound form unavailable, not forgetting, disconnection. The architecture of retrieval has always involved this two-stage structure, semantics first, phonology second. Aging does not destroy either stage. It degrades the efficiency of the link between them. This also explains why proper names are disproportionately vulnerable. Unlike common nouns, names carry no semantic predictability. The name of a person tells you nothing useful about who they are. It is an arbitrary label connected to a face by familiarity alone. There is no backup route, no synonym, no conceptual approximation, no alternative phrasing that delivers the same information. Either the phonological form activates, or it does not. And when white matter efficiency between the face recognition system and the name retrieval network degrades, the connection fails silently, while everything else about the person remains perfectly intact. Part 6. When compensation begins to cost more than it yields the limits of the adaptive system. Every compensation strategy has a ceiling. The frontal lobe can expand its involvement in retrieval. It can increase allocation of executive resources toward tasks that previously required less management. It can recruit bilateral networks where unilateral networks once sufficed. For a long time, this expansion maintains performance. But neural resources are finite. Attention is finite. Executive capacity is finite. A frontal lobe increasingly occupied with compensating for degraded posterior efficiency has less capacity available for the tasks frontal regions were originally specialized to perform. Planning under uncertainty, inhibiting impulsive responses, maintaining complex goals across time, switching between competing priorities without losing track of either. These are frontal functions that depend on available executive bandwidth. As compensation consumes more of that bandwidth, the efficiency of these higher-order functions begins to decline. Not because frontal tissue is failing directly, but because the frontal system is running closer to capacity, simply maintaining what it is already compensating for. This is the second-order consequence that rarely appears in simplified explanations of brain aging. The degradation of white matter pathways does not only affect the regions those pathways connect, it indirectly taxes the regions recruited to compensate. The compensation strategy itself becomes a source of cognitive load. The system responds to inefficiency by increasing effort. Increased effort consumes the very resources needed for other functions. The functions dependent on those resources become slightly less reliable. The person notices this as fatigue, as needing more time, as conversations that require more concentration, as decisions that feel slightly more demanding than they once did. None of it reads as neurological change. All of it is. The accumulation behind the visible moment. A familiar face appears. The recognition system activates immediately. Visual processing, face-selective regions in the fusiform gyrus, the associative networks connecting that face to a history of shared experience. All of this operates normally. The relationship is intact. The memories are intact. The name is not available. What has happened biologically in that moment is this. The white matter pathway connecting face recognition to lexical retrieval has degraded in transmission efficiency. The phonological form of the name exists in long-term memory. The connection between the face and that phonological representation is slower to activate than it once was. The frontal retrieval system increases its involvement, searching, generating candidates, evaluating possibilities. The inhibitory system attempts to suppress incorrect responses, while the correct one assembles. The process takes a few seconds longer than it should. The name arrives. The conversation continues. None of that biological sequence is visible. None of it is felt. What is felt is the outcome. A brief pause, a moment of reaching, a small effort where no effort used to be required. And beneath that outcome is the accumulated result of years of myelin change, years of retrieval network reorganization, years of frontal compensation gradually absorbing the slack, all of it operating continuously, invisibly, across a timeline that long predates the moment anyone noticed. The missing name was not the event. The missing name was the threshold, the point where the accumulated biological distance between the face and its phonological label finally exceeded what the compensation system could cover in real time. What ordinary stability conceals. The broader implication extends beyond language, beyond names, beyond any single cognitive function. The experience of cognitive stability, the sense that thinking is reliable, that memory is intact, that one is functioning normally, is the product of an adaptive system, working continuously to maintain outputs that the person will interpret as unchanged. It is not evidence of an unchanged system. It is evidence of a system that is still successfully managing the gap between what it was and what it is now. That gap has a direction. It moves one way. The white matter continues changing. Myelin maintenance becomes less efficient with each passing decade. The retrieval networks become slightly noisier. The frontal compensation expands to cover more ground. The executive bandwidth available for other tasks continues narrowing. The person, living inside this system, experiences the outputs. The outputs, for a long time, remain intact enough to interpret as normal. The brain ages in the space between what the biology is doing and what the person feels. Most of the important events in that process, the myelin changes, the network reorganization, the gradual shift from automatic to controlled retrieval, occur in a register that consciousness cannot access. There is no signal for white matter degradation. There is no internal alarm for a retrieval pathway losing fidelity. There is no sensation that accompanies the frontal lobe quietly expanding its workload. There is only the experience of a brain that still mostly works, that finds the word, retrieves the name, completes the sentence, while the machinery producing that experience has been reorganizing itself around the change for longer than the person has known to look. The word arrives. The moment passes. Beneath it, the system that delivered the word is not what it was. It simply has not yet become something the person can feel.
Pathology of Fear is a medical documentary series presenting clinically documented neurologic and pathological mechanisms for educational analysis.